This introduction is just a sliver of the many accomplishments that Erwin Kotler has made. Mr. Kotler is the chairman of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, an emeritus professor of law at McGill University, former member of Parliament, former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, and an international human rights lawyer. In 2014, he was elected Canadian Parliamentarian of the Year by his colleagues and recently received the Law Society of Upper Canada's inaugural Human Rights Award. In its citation, the Law Society recognized the Honorable Erwin Kotler's tireless efforts to ensure peace and justice for all. In his varied roles as law professor, constitutional and comparative law scholar, international human rights lawyer, counsel to prisoners of conscience, public intellectual, peace activist, member of Parliament, and Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, Mr. Kotler has been a leader and role model. Through his advocacy work in Canada and internationally, he has transformed the lives of many. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the Honorable Erwin Kotler.
Thank you for those very kind words of introduction. It's a real pleasure to participate in the common cause which brings us together of Holocaust remembrance and education, and this is part of the larger struggle, as we've heard reflexively in the panels, part of the larger struggle for the pursuit of justice and the combating of injustice in our time. And to join here the distinguished scholars, lecturers, the law enforcement officials, educators, and in particular, Holocaust survivors, the bearers of memory and witness, the personification of inspiration and action that have found expression here in this conference. And I want to commend the friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center for Holocaust Studies for convening such a distinguished group of participants so that we can listen and learn and act upon the lessons. We meet today at an important moment of remembrance and reminder. We meet, as has been mentioned, on the occasion of the International Day of Holocaust Remembrance of horrors too terrible to be believed, but not too terrible to have happened. On the 73rd anniversary of the liberation of the death camp Auschwitz, the most brutal extermination camp of the 20th century, as the oldest working journalist and Holocaust survivor, Noah Kliger, put it in a seminar that we had in Israel a week ago, and I've just come back from Israel, where he summed it up by saying that Auschwitz is the largest cemetery in the world in which there are no graves. And meeting also on the 73rd anniversary of the imprisonment and disappearance of Raoul Wallenberg, message and metaphor of righteous among the nations, where 10 days ago at Yad Vashem, there was a ceremony in remembrance and in tribute to Raoul Wallenberg, in tribute to a person who demonstrated how one person with the compassion to care and the courage to act can confront evil, resist, prevail, and thereby transform history. And so on this anniversary of anniversaries, we must ask ourselves, what is it that we have learned? And more importantly, what is it that we must do? And how can Holocaust education underpin that task? And what I'd like to do with you is share some foundational principles for Holocaust remembrance and education, and seeing it also in the larger context of learning and doing, of pursuing justice and combating injustice. The first principle is the danger of forgetting and the imperative of remembrance, of Zachor, le devoir the memoir. As Elie Wiesel put it, remembrance is a sacred duty. Of the Holocaust, as Wiesel would put it, as a war against the Jews in which, and in this, Avi quoted it also in his remarks yesterday evening, in which not all victims were Jews, but all Jews were targeted victims. Of the remembrance of victims defamed, dehumanized, demonized as prologue and justification for their mass murder, where the mass murder of 6 million Jews and millions of non-Jews is not just a matter of abstract statistics, but as we always say at moments of remembrance, unto each person there is a name. Each person bears an identity. Each person is a universe, reminding us always of the Talmudic imperative that whoever saves a single life, it is as if he has saved an entire universe, but whoever kills a single person, it is as if he has killed an entire universe. And so the abiding lesson emerging from this and underpinning the pursuit of justice, that we are each, wherever we are, the guarantors of each other's existence. And as the Czech novelist Milan Kundera put it, the struggle of memory against forgetting is a struggle of freedom against tyranny. Which brings me now to the second lesson, and that is the danger of state-sanctioned incitement to hatred and genocide, the responsibility to prevent. The Holocaust and the genocides that followed occurred not simply because of the machinery of death, the industry of death, but because of state-sanctioned incitement to hate and to genocide. It is this teaching of contempt, this demonizing of the other, this is where it all begins. As the Supreme Court of Canada put it in a precedent and principle reaffirmed in the International Criminal Tribunals for former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, the Holocaust did not begin in the gas chamber, said the court. And you saw this in Max Eisen's slide yesterday. It began with words. These, as the court put it, are the chilling facts of history. These, as the court put it, are the catastrophic effects of racism. And in a more recent principle and precedent, which remains regrettably largely unknown, but should not only be learned and acted upon, I'm referring to the Supreme Court holding in the Mugesera case, where Leon Mugesera, a Rwandan, came to Canada in 1992, sought refugee status. His case went before the courts, and finally, as the case came before the Supreme Court of Canada, the initiative came to deport him back to Rwanda on the grounds that he had participated in crimes against humanity in Rwanda. And his defense was, well, how could I have been involved in crimes against humanity in Rwanda, in the genocide in Rwanda? I came to Canada in 1992. The genocide in Rwanda occurred in 1994, and the court held in a very compelling principle and precedent that the very incitement to hate and genocide constitutes the crime, whether or not acts of genocide follow. And so state parties to the Genocide Convention have a responsibility. It's not a policy option. We have a responsibility to act to prevent and hold accountable those that engage in incitement to genocide. Which brings me now to a third lesson and underpinning principle for the pursuit of justice, and that is the danger of anti-Semitism, the responsibility here to prevent and combat. Of anti-Semitism is not only the oldest, but the most enduring of hatreds. Of anti-Semitism as a paradigm of radical hatred, the same way as the Holocaust is a paradigm of radical evil, a lethal obsession, as Professor Robert Wistrich put it in his masterly work of the same name, where from 1941 to 1945, 1.3 million people were deported to Auschwitz and murdered in Auschwitz. 1.1 million of them were Jews. Let there be no mistake about it. Jews were murdered at Auschwitz because of anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism did not die at Auschwitz. It remains the mutated and bloodied canary in the mineshaft of global evil. And as we've learned only too tragically and too well, that while it begins with Jews, it doesn't end with Jews. And so we should also learn and act upon it, and saying so is wrong. But singling Israel out for differential and discriminatory treatment, denying Israel's right to exist, let alone calling for its destruction, is discriminatory, hateful, and anti-Semitic, and not saying so is hypocritical. Fourth lesson: the danger of silence in the face of evil, the imperative of speaking up and acting against injustice. As Elie Wiesel put it in his 1986 Nobel Peace Prize lecture, and I quote, "We must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Wherever men or women are persecuted because of their race, religion, or political views, that place must, at that moment, become the center of the universe." And he added, "There may be times when we are powerless to prevent injustice, but there must never be a time when we fail to protect and protest against injustice." In a word, we have a responsibility always to speak up and act against injustice, and not look around to see whoever else may be standing before we make a judgment to do so. Because regrettably, in the world in which we live, there are few people prepared to stand, let alone to act against injustice. The fifth lesson is the danger of the Holocaust denial movement. And I would add to that not only the Holocaust denial movement, but the Holocaust distortion and inversion movement. In other words, the Holocaust denial movement, the cutting edge of anti-Semitism, old and new, is not just an assault on Jewish memory and human dignity in its accusation that the Holocaust is a hoax. Rather, it constitutes an international criminal conspiracy to cover up the worst crimes in history. Here is the historiography of the Holocaust in the most tragic, bitter irony, in its ultimate Orwellian inversion. First, we move from the genocide of the Jewish people to a denial that the genocide ever took place. And then, in a classic Orwellian cover-up of this international conspiracy, the Holocaust denial movement whitewashes the crimes of the Nazis as it excoriates so-called crimes of the Jews. Indeed, it not only holds that the Holocaust was a hoax, but maligns the Jews for fabricating the hoax. And so it's our responsibility to unmask the bearers of false witness, to expose the criminality of the deniers as we protect the dignity of their victims, to guard against Holocaust inversion in the Nazification of Israel and the Jewish people, and to guard against Holocaust distortion, as we witnessed just yesterday, yet again, in the attempt in Poland to adopt a law which effectively will whitewash crimes as committed by Polish perpetrators at the same time that it provides exculpatory immunity for those engaged in the commission of those crimes. And Poland is not alone in this. We have seen too many manifestations of this recently in parts of Eastern Europe and elsewhere. Which brings me now to the next lesson, and that is the sixth lesson, that the Holocaust resulted not only, as I said, from state-sanctioned incitement to hate and to genocide, not only from the evil of anti-Semitism, but from crimes of indifference, from conspiracies of silence. What makes the Holocaust, and if you will, the Rwandan genocide, where 10,000 people were murdered every day for 100 days. What makes the Holocaust and the genocide in Rwanda so unspeakable is not only the horror of the Holocaust and the genocide in Rwanda. What makes them so unspeakable is that they were preventable. Nobody can say that we did not know. More and more documentation is coming out how Allied leaders knew about the Holocaust as early as 1942. And these are emerging in dispatches now from Allied leaders in Britain and elsewhere. And with regard to Rwanda or Darfur, nobody could say we did not know. We knew, but we did not act. And more recently, with regard to Syria, the greatest humanitarian catastrophe since the end of the Second World War. And I remember when in March 2011, a group of young people marched in Dara, a village south of Damascus, and marched with olive branches and said, "Peace, peace, dignity, dignity." And they were gunned down by Assad's forces. Others who came to replace them, young people, were also disappeared and murdered. And so, as we approached the end of 2011, December 2011, there were only, quote unquote, 7,000 dead. Only, quote unquote, some 10,000 that were displaced. But those of us who called at the time for the implementation of the responsibility to protect principle, which says that if in any country there are war crimes or crimes against humanity being committed, and in that country the government is unable or unwilling to do anything about it, or worse, as in the case of Assad's Syria, is the author of those crimes, then there's a responsibility on behalf of the international community to intervene and protect those victims, as adopted unanimously in the Security Council and UN General Assembly in 2005, where Canada was a leading architect of that R2P principle. But those of us who argued at the end of 2011 that the time had come to intervene in Syria, that this was a classic R2P case, we're told, well, you know, if you intervene, this will lead to civil war, this will lead to sectarian warfare, this will lead to jihadists coming in. Everything we were told would happen if we intervened happened because we didn't intervene. And so we are in a situation now, staggering in it. And again, when I mention statistics, remember always, human beings are behind these statistics. That close to 600,000 have been killed. And as I said, at that time, at the end of 2011, we were talking only about 7 or 8,000. 600,000 have been killed. We are talking about 12.5 million Syrians that have been displaced. Displaced when we had only at the time 20,000, when R2P could have at that time saved and protect the targeted and innocent civilians. And where we've had more than 5 million refugees resulting, as I said, from the greatest of humanitarian catastrophes since the end of the Second World War. Don't think that we learned our lessons from Syria. What's happening, and you might have been thinking about, is the Rohingya and the ethnic cleansing from Myanmar to Bangladesh. And you know, what disturbs me is I sat on a Foreign Affairs Committee, I was vice chair of the committee, when in 2013 we warned about the impending disaster in Rohingya. We called a press conference to sound the alarm, and nobody came. And when I saw some journalists afterwards in the hall, and I said, you know, we had this press conference today, and they said, oh yeah, something about Ringi. I said, yeah, about the Rohingya in Burma that are the objects of ethnic cleansing. Their answer was, well, sorry, we're covering, these allegations against sexual propriety that have been going on. I said to them, well, I always thought that you guys can walk and chew gum at the same time. And so we didn't intervene when intervention was required, and we know the tragic results that have occurred with regard to Rohingya. Which brings me to the next lesson, and that is that we have failed to realize the dangers of the cultures of impunity, of not bringing war criminals to justice. If the 20th century, with the Holocaust in Rwanda, and the 21st century, what happened in Rwanda, and Darfur, and the Congo, and Syria, were ages of atrocity, also ages of impunity. Few of the perpetrators have been brought to justice. And when we don't bring the perpetrators to justice, we not only indulge and encourage a culture of impunity, but we encourage more crimes and we enable more criminals. And so the responsibility always to bring war criminals to justice as an overriding responsibility and principle, growing also out of Holocaust remembrance and education and the pursuit of justice. Brings me to the next lesson, and that is the trahison d'éclair, the responsibility of speaking truth to power. Simply put, the Holocaust was made possible not only by the bureaucratization of genocide, as the sociologist Robert Lifton put it, and as the Nazi death murderer Adolf Eichmann personified, but because of the trahison d'éclair, the complicity of the elites, including physicians, church leaders, judges, lawyers, engineers, architects, educators, and the like. Holocaust crimes, then, were the crimes of the Nuremberg elites. And so it is our responsibility always to speak truth to power and to hold power accountable to truth. The double entendre of Nuremberg, of the Nuremberg of hate and the Nuremberg principles, must be part of our learning as it is part of our legacy. The ninth lesson is the danger of the assault on the vulnerable and on the powerless. Indeed, is revealing, as Professor Henry Freelander pointed out in his book on the origins of genocide, of the Nazi genocide, that the first group singled out for mass killing in the Holocaust were the Jewish disabled. And so it's our responsibility always to give voice to the voiceless and empower the powerless, be they the disabled, the poor, the elderly, women victimized by violence, or vulnerable children, the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. The test of a just society always is how do we treat the most vulnerable amongst us. It brings me to a 10th lesson and moving to a close, and that is targeted violence against women. And Wendy Lauer gave a very compelling talk on this today, and I just very briefly to sum it up, that the Holocaust and the genocides since have included horrific crimes against women. Moreover, these crimes against women have not only attended these genocides or been in consequence of it, as is very often articulated, but they have been in pursuit of the genocide itself. Yet they remain the still unarticulated horrors of the genocides of our time and also even of European Jewry. Some 70 years later, that lesson remains to be learned and acted upon. Whether we speak of the horrific crimes against Yazidi women or crimes against women in the Congo or in Syria, Boko Haram and the like. We must appreciate that significant numbers of the world's population are routinely subject to rape, assault, torture, starvation, humiliation, mutilation, and even murder because they are women. 11th lesson, mass atrocities against children and our responsibility to prevent and protect. If there is an atrocity that belies understanding, it is the willful exploitation, maiming, and killing of a child, the most vulnerable of the vulnerable, as I mentioned. Indeed, it is sometimes forgotten that the Nazi genocide was a genocide of millions of children. 1.5 million children perished in the Holocaust of European Jewry. But we have yet to learn from this horrific of horrors, let alone act upon it. As we meet, millions of children the world over are subjected to arbitrary detention, torture, cruel, inhumane and degrading treatment, slavery, execution, and recruitment as child soldiers incited to terrorize and kill others. As my daughter Gila, and I always quote her because most profound human rights lesson that I ever learned when she taught me this at the age of, when she was then 15, now 37 years of age, when she said to me, "Daddy, if you want to know what the real test of human rights is, always ask yourself, at any time, in any situation, in any part of the world, is it good for children? Is what is happening good for children? That's the real test of human rights, Daddy." The next lesson is the danger, as I mentioned, of a bystander community, and therefore our responsibility to remember and pay tribute to the rescuers, to the righteous among the nations, of whom I mentioned Raoul Wallenberg is metaphor and message. It's sometimes forgotten, if indeed it is sufficiently well known, that in the months between May and July 1944, 440,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to their death in Auschwitz. The cruelest, most efficient, fastest killing field in all of the Holocaust. And this was 1944, where nobody could say we did not know, where the world remained an accomplice, a bystander, an enabler. And then Raoul Wallenberg came to the Swedish legation in Budapest in July 1944. And in the next 5 months, Wallenberg and those others, righteous Gentiles and those whom he mobilized to assist him in that objective, saved a remnant of 100,000 Jews. So what a small group of committed people could do, who had the compassion to care and the courage to act, an entire international community could not bring itself to do. As it was not only a bystander community, but tragically an enabler community, a complicit community in what occurred. And may I close by making reference to the importance of the legacy of Holocaust survivors and those here today, and their important and compelling testimony. And as my visit to Yad Vashem just a few days ago before I returned to Israel, each time you go to Yad Vashem, you learn something new, and you learn, tragically also, something horrible in that something new, but you cannot fail to be inspired by the courage of the survivors. And so we must always remember and celebrate the survivors of the Holocaust, the true heroes of humanity. For they witnessed and endured the worst of inhumanity, but somehow found in the depths of their own humanity the courage to go on, to rebuild their families as they rebuilt our own communities. And so to those here and to those who, wherever they are, always know that we learn from you, We are inspired by you, and we hope only that we can effectively act upon the lessons that you are teaching us. And I have to say that when I went to Yad Vashem, another compelling truth that we sometimes forget, maybe because I went to Yad Vashem in Israel, and maybe because it was on the eve of the 70th anniversary of evil, and maybe because of the juxtaposition of all these anniversaries, and maybe because of the dangers of indifference and inaction on the part of the international community. I was reminded yet again that it is often said that if there had not been a Holocaust, there would not have been a state of Israel, as if 6 million murdered Jews was the raison d'etre for the creation of Israel. But it's the other way around, and we must never forget it. That if there had been a state of Israel, there might well not have been a Holocaust or the horrors of Jewish history. And that is why Elie Wiesel always spoke of the importance and the compellability, and as we approach now the 70th anniversary of the State of Israel, the importance, as he always said, of realizing the importance of the State of Israel, not only to the Jewish people, but as giving expression to the notion of never again in terms of not only learning, but acting upon that, not as a slogan or an idle slogan, but as a commitment and implementation to action. And so, together with the Holocaust survivors, we must remember and we must pledge that never again will we be indifferent to incitement and hate, that never again will we be silent in the face of evil, that never again will we indulge racism and anti-Semitism, that never again will we ignore the plight of the vulnerable, that never again will we be indifferent in the face of mass atrocity and impunity. But we will speak up and we will act against racism, against hatred, against anti-Semitism, against mass atrocity, against injustice, and against the crime of crimes whose name we should even shudder to mention, namely genocide. And so may this International Day of Holocaust Remembrance, may this coming together in this conference and the learning of the lessons and imperatives of Holocaust education, may this be not only an act of remembrance, which it is, but let it always be a remembrance to act, which it must be. Thank you.